The format for our evening is that I'm going to start with a brief introduction, and my colleague Barbara Lippens, who is also part of our team, will say something about the context of this project. And then we'd like to share the film that we've made with you. We have a panel of 3 speakers who will really briefly pick up some points that they want to make, and then this is very much going to be also a discussion with you, so we'll open it up to discussion. Just want to say a couple of things about well, before I say anything about the film, maybe Barbara, can I hand over to you, and then you can tell everybody a bit about the project, and then we'll talk about the film.
Great. So hello everybody, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to say a few words about this collaboration between DPU and Genre en Action. So it's part of our collaboration between the 2 organizations, which has the support also of the French Institute in London, and as part, I think, of their program of events around on the road to COP21, I think is how you call it. Huh? So Genre en Action and DPU have been collaborating for quite a while together, and it's 2 organizations that really seek to forefront issues of gender in thinking about development planning. For both, and especially I think in the increasingly pressing context of climate change, thinking about climate change. For both organizations, the notion of sustainable development or climate compatible development means thinking about just transitions and just development, which inevitably involves thinking about gender inequalities and other social identities. This particular collaboration started in December last year with an event that was organized by Genre en Action, by Claudie Vouet, who is here. And I think it was part of you can tell us maybe a little bit more about it, but it was part of an attempt to start bringing these notions of gender much more to the forefront of COP21, and to try and start bringing the gender lens in discussions in COP21. So at that event, I represented the DPU, and it became quite clear that my presentation was more or less the only one that addressed a particularly urban focus when thinking about gender and about climate change. Sorry, particular urban focus, that's it. And it became apparent that actually there is a gap in the literature and in advocacy in trying to bring these 3 issues together, which is urban, gender, and climate change. And I guess this event and the work that we are doing at the moment, this collaboration, is an attempt to try and start bridging that gap.
So let me just say a few words about the film itself. First of all, this is going to be the first public showing of it. And the idea was, when we first started talking about it, was to try to make more visible the different kinds of narratives in different parts of the world, because we thought, but we weren't sure, that perhaps the discourse around these issues was different in Latin America, maybe different in Francophone countries and different in Anglophone countries. In reality, I think we found a lot of common threads, which I think you'll begin to see in the film. The film itself will be used as a resource for both research and advocacy in the future, and of course coming up in the first instance is the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as COP21. And I know certainly we're Genre en Action, and the DPU will be using it in different ways on the road to COP21. I also would just like to say that we regard this as a work in progress. So although we're showing this film to you for the first time in public, the film itself will probably change a little bit over the next couple of months as we involve more people, and probably as we will have to cut it down a bit given its different uses. So you're going to see the very first showing of it. Before you have a look at the film, I just want to thank the other team members who've been involved in this. Barbara Lippens, Adriana Allen, who unfortunately can't be here, Claudie Vouet from Genre en Action, And I'd like to, in particular, mention Camilla Cosina, who's behind the camera there. She spent a lot of time behind the camera, and she's done a lot of the filming and all the editing of this film, and indeed also some of the translation of the Spanish speakers. So thank you so much, Camilla, for your wonderful work, and I think you're going to find it an interesting film. So let's have a look at the film, and then I'll introduce the panel to you afterwards. I would like to start with Virginie Lemasson, who is a research officer at the ODI, the Overseas Development Institute. She works on the social development and climate and environment programs at the ODI. And she's also the gender focal point for CDKN, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network supported by DFID. And her research focuses on the gender dimensions of disaster risk reduction and climate change mitigation and adaptation. And she's currently been involved in a big project, which I hope she's going to share a little bit of the initial very preliminary findings around her work, and perhaps pick up some of the issues that we saw in the film.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Thank you very much to Barbara and Karen for your invitation and this great opportunity to talk more in depth on these linkages between social justice and environmental issues, especially bridging the Francophone world and the English-speaking community. What I'd like to share with you in the next 10 minutes is some of the concrete examples of those linkages at the local level, with examples from a research project that CDKN has been conducting in collaboration with Practical Action and IDS. This project started last year with a literature review that emphasized the very same gap that were highlighted in the movie. This gap between in the literature on urban issues, gender equality, as well as climate change. And so we designed a research project that tries to bring those linkages back onto the development agenda and trying to set up recommendations for policymakers to better inform development practices. We have comparative studies with case studies from Peru, Kenya, and India, and tonight I'd like to share some of the findings from India. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my colleague Ritu Sogani, who is based in India, and I had a discussion with her on Monday where she wanted to highlight some of the key messages that I'm going to share with you. The Indian case study look at problems linked with periodic flooding, and the flooding that are occurring in the particular case study of Gorakhpur, which is in eastern Uttar Pradesh in India. They are reinforced by heavier rainfall, but also unsustainable development practices linked with inadequate waste management. So I really want to emphasize that it's not just about climate change, it's about also inadequate urbanization, or unplanned urbanization. Some of the findings that were found by the team of researchers over there show really well why a gender perspective is really important. Let me just share with you this very typical example of accessing sanitation and going to the toilet. In the case study of Gorakhpur, and particularly the low-income area of Gorakhpur, where the team did the research, people are facing several months of constant flooding. So they live in 1 meter deep water every day for several weeks. And so imagine going to try to find a spot to go to the toilet every day when you're a woman, and also when you're wearing a sari. It's become extremely stressful for women in particular, because unlike men, they can't just find a wall and then do whatever they want to do. So this poses questions of insecurity, because they have to go very early in the morning or very late at night. But it also raises the problem of unsustainable coping strategies, because in order for them to avoid having to struggle going to the toilet, they said during focus group discussion that they start to eat and drink less, which means obviously that their health is severely impacted by the very basic fact that they can't go to the toilet. So to me, it really brings the three dimension into perspective, this notion of unplanned urbanization, gender inequalities, inadequate basic services, and the negative impacts of climate change. There are other examples where women are affected differently. I'm not saying women are more impacted, but it's to echo the words of Linda from Peru. It's really this question of differences as opposed to women are more vulnerable. Women spend more time indoors because of their socially constructed roles of having to look for reproductive activities. But for instance, in the summer, when temperatures reach 50 degrees Celsius, they are the ones who struggle a lot with the heat. And in poor income households, this becomes extremely difficult to deal with because people might not have access to an adequate source of electrical supply or fan. And those who stay indoors are more affected by heat and health risks associated with heat. Other examples that we found in a particular urban context was that women emphasized that they had a lower access to social resources. Another woman in the movie said that women have this social capital that should be valued, but we found in India that this social capital becomes undermined by the fact that the community is composed of many migrants, and the social bond within the community is perhaps less developed than in rural areas where they're coming from. But the team also found that this level of social cohesion actually increased during times of stress, and the disaster actually brought people together, which is, I think, a finding that we should bear in mind when implementing disaster risk reduction and recovery. The other point that I wanted to share with you was this very contradiction that women do not control key assets such as ownership of the land, ownership of the house, as well as control of the household budget. But at the same time, in the case of Gorakhpur, they are primarily responsible for taking loans and to pay them back. So this creates a huge amount of stress on women because they often have to sell the jewelry so that they can have some cash to provide for their family. But at the same time, they are the ones who have to repay it back. And the reason why they are responsible for that is because men are seen not responsible enough, not trustworthy, primarily because of problems of alcoholism. So again, this perspective, social perspective, social issues become really important to take into consideration when implementing any kind of resilience-based project or urban planning. The final point I wanted to make is the fact that the project that the team reviewed to look at the impact, and you can hopefully find some of the results later on our website, on CDKN website. They found that a project can still be gender sensitive even if they have not necessarily used a gender approach right from the start. And it was possible in the urban context because the practitioners went in the neighborhoods and they actually found many women to talk to, given the fact that women in the urban context spend more time next to their house. In rural areas, they're often found to be out in the field, and therefore, for NGOs to access women, they have to go back to certain hours of the day. So that was, I think, a really crucial findings, and that was great in terms of participatory approaches because it meant that the team managed to gather focus group discussion where women outnumbered the number of men, and women then became more confident to raise their concern. So that was possible because the team had a participatory approach to their activities. So, and also it meant that they implemented activities that addressed the needs of women. On the other hand, the problem of not having an explicit gender approach meant that when developing any kind of policy advocacy, none of the gender perspective was raised to policymakers. And although women's needs were addressed, women's position wasn't actually enhanced. And that's the shortcoming that we often found in literature on gender justice and environmental projects. And so our early findings in our project show that gender approaches must be explicit in climate compatible development or in environmental based projects, for projects not to be neutral, because if they are neutral they're often male biased, but for projects to really address the position of women in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to call next on Claudie Vouet, who you've already seen in the film. Claudie is a former colleague of ours at the DPU a long time ago. She's a very experienced gender and development consultant internationally. That her experience spans both the Anglophone and Francophone countries for quite a few decades now. On her return to France, Claudie co-founded in 2003 Genre en Action, and a Francophone network, which I think she'll tell us a little bit more about, with a group of gender pioneers in France at the time. She was the first coordinator of that network, and since 2009 to 2014 she was the president of the association that actually manages that network. So I'll hand over to you, Claudie.
Thank you, Karen. First, quite a nice feeling to be back at the DPU, wearing a different hat. The hat I'll be wearing tonight is a bit less that of an international consultant, but more that of an activist. Because talking on behalf of Genre en Action, I'm definitely talking from an activist perspective. Even though I think most of us working on gender do know that it is a position where you often have to wear different hats, and very often at the same time. And I think it's quite important to actually mention that I'm talking as an activist, because it allows me to, well, I will take permission from myself to say things about certain things that you can't say when you're a consultant sometimes. As Barbara mentioned, when we organized that conference at the end of last year in Paris, it was all around Beijing, Beijing plus 20 years after the Fourth World Conference, International Conference on Women in 1995, and in terms of positions around gender inequalities, it's actually much stronger than what is currently in the SDG. So that's what we wanted to do in Paris. So we invited Barbara, and we had one workshop which was on sustainable development. And of course, because COP21 is happening in Paris, there's a lot of hype at the moment. I'm not too sure that we would be talking that much about climate change and gender if it were not happening in Paris at the moment. I mean, at least in my environment, there's definitely a lot of advocacy work being done, but also a lot of communication work, which of course when you wear your activist hat is always a little worrying, because you wonder how far, how long the light are going to stay on when the show is over. And when we had that discussion in Paris, it was quite obvious, like Barbara said, that when, particularly in Francophone countries, where people talk about sustainable development and climate change, they mean rural. The urban stuff just didn't come into the picture at all, and everybody actually found it quite interesting that Barbara was coming up with that. And of course, one of the reasons why we started that network in 2003 was exactly because of wanting to bridge the gap that a lot of us felt, having worked in Anglophone countries, the gap that we felt between the way that gender was emerging and was being tackled in Francophone countries and the way it was being done in Anglophone and Spanish-speaking countries and Asian countries. And that gap that we have noticed about just about every aspect of gender, we are also now seeing it quite clearly around issues of climate change and the link to urbanization. And probably were very different in the way that we were behind the thinking and the practice. And one of the interesting result of having had that little conversation that you saw through the movie is to actually start realizing that nobody is really ahead in any case on that topic. But in terms of Francophone countries, we've been really struggling over the last 5 or 6 years, or maybe 10, to to make the Francophone voices heard in the climate change debate. When you do a literature search, there's virtually nothing written in French on the subject, or very, very little compared to what is written in other languages. And we know, working with activists from different countries, and I'm thinking in particular of this group in Mali that is really pushing the issue forward at the moment, it's very difficult for them to go and attend any kind of conferences, any kind of meeting. One reason being also the information. You know, there's a real language gap in terms of accessing the information. And it's quite important that they should go, and they really want to go, because it's not just that they want to go and listen to what is being talked about on climate change. It's also because there are some very specific issues to Francophone countries that they would like to put across. And one of them is the connection between conflict and climate change, and how it is now impacting also on urbanization. I mean, a lot of countries in West Africa at the moment and in Central Africa have been at war for for decades. And new conflicts are emerging all the time. And of course what we see with that is a lot of movement, a lot of displacement, a lot of migration towards cities. I was in the Congo back in July, and Kinshasa is probably the only country in Francophone Africa that has over 10 million inhabitants. Urbanization doesn't look at all the same in Francophone Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, as it does in Latin America. The huge megapole, the metropoles of South America are just not present in Francophone countries. But the way that cities are shaping at the moment, particularly through conflict, is quite, obviously quite worrying, because it's really exploding at the seams, and the infrastructures are just not following, and the health situation is becoming really, really precarious. And we can see that women are really, really carrying the heavy very load of that. The care, the workload around the care is really increasing incredibly. And yet, urbanization programs seem to carry on as if, this is not really happening. And what we find it very difficult is, again, wearing the activist hat, is to make things happen at the local level in terms of women organizing to make their voices heard. And that's the reason why I really insisted on the movie, on the issue of political participation. In terms of gender inequalities, most Francophone countries are right at the bottom of the, they're really at, top or bottom, whichever way you want to look at it, but the indicators on gender inequalities are very, very high. And one indicator that is really, really high is on political participation. And we're not talking just parliament, we're talking at all levels of political participation. And in Kinshasa, for instance, what was very, very obvious is that the only time that women are being called upon is when something needs to be fixed. Like the water system is not working properly, so the women are going to come and fix it because they really care about water. And the minute that is done, then that's it. It's over. They go back to being just strict water users. So there's really a big shift that we have to make between working on access to resources and really the issue of control, but control in a political way. And that work is just not being done. It's very difficult for these groups to find proper long-term support for their action. Julian in the film is talking about the market fundamentalism, but there's also the kind of aid fundamentalism that everything now has to be a project and it has to be done in 3 weeks, and it after 2 years you just forget about it. There's kind of long-term involvement in transforming relations so that the city can also transform around gender relations and not the other way around. Is quite problematic. So finance, I can't remember who mentions it in the movie, finance for transforming and for working with gender relations in relation to the urbanization and city management is really, really one thing that we are very concerned about. we're still very much witnessing efforts to make women work for the city, but not cities work for women. I mean, that's really what we're noticing now. And climate change, there's a huge gap in terms of research. We know very little about what is exactly happening in cities in relation to gender. And there's a huge effort that has to be made investing in long-term research and probably going back to some kind of research that are really very much based on action research that really gets women to talk for themselves. I think the whole issue of local knowledge and making local knowledge emerge and not just having consultants talking on behalf of, that's why I removed my consultant's hat, is a very big issue. So I'm not saying Francophone countries are different, but they are facing particular issues. Conflict is one of them, and it's not a small one to be addressed at the moment. So I'll just finish for now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I won't talk too long because I think I already got the chance to talk a bit in the film and I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have been saying. So I was just thinking about what I should say after you've already seen the film, and actually yesterday when I was thinking about this, a friend called up and said, did I want to go out for a drink this evening? I said I can't because I'm going to be at the symposium on gender and urbanisation and climate change. And he said, oh, is that like some sort of parlour game where you have to talk about three completely unrelated things and pretend there are linkages? Which is the kind of, he's a very irritating person. So he thinks he's being witty and provocative, but actually he's just being annoying. So my tendency was to ignore him at that point. But actually him saying that did make me think that I think presumably a lot of us here as well will see those links because these are fields we work in and things we're interested in. So the links sort of seem apparent to us. But actually, and I think this has come up a lot, those links aren't visible to a lot of people, and particularly people who are involved in this area of policy. And I think actually, even though I'd say, for us the links feel obvious, they sort of feel obvious, but actually they're quite difficult to articulate. And I think part of the problem is when I was thinking about preparing to say something for the film, the problem is it's quite easy to talk about gender and climate change, it's quite easy to talk about urbanisation and climate change. To bring the three together, you fall into this trap that Karen was talking about in the film with the silos. It's very hard to think how you operate outside these specific areas of gender, of urbanisation, of climate change. And it's very hard to get the sort of concrete idea of the reality of what that means and how that plays out, which is why I think research like ODI are doing in practical action is very important to actually say, well, what does this mean in empirical terms? How does this play out? So thinking about that, I think this film, I think it does a very nice job of beginning to make those linkages clearer. And I think for me, the sort of key things that come out are firstly, which I think is the easier thing to engage with, that the impacts of climate change are gendered, of course, because they're impacting people's lives, and that depends on how we're placed within the gender division of labour, access to resources. And that gender division of labour and our social practices will be different for women and men in urban and rural areas. So I think we can see how that would play out. I think the second thing which tends to be trickier is not just that climate change is gendered and plays out for women and men differently in an urban setting, but also that the responses, the solutions that we're offering also have implications for gender relations and also for how we're shaping the cities we live in as women and men. And I think it's really important to be vigilant about that because that can go in two directions. So on the one hand, responses to climate change can collude with existing gender relations and existing injustices in the shaping of urban space, and I think we may see that happening. And I think there are a number of points in the film where various of the people talk about that. So one thing that I was trying to raise there is the concerns with sort of market solutions to development, which have been very significant in how we're seeing urban development at the moment, and also very significant in terms of gender justice. If we access things through the marketplace, it tends to exacerbate inequalities. And I think some of the sort of solutions to climate change around the sort of smart cities discourses can tend to extend those inequalities. And I think maybe that's also a helpful way to look at the sort of market system, because again, as I think Sue Parnell says in the thing, when we begin to look at this juxtaposition of gender and cities and climate change, it's easiest to think about the concrete realities when we look very much at micro-level experiences. And it's hard to think, well, what happens when we scale this up to the city level, and how how do we engage with that then? So I think that's one way it can conclude. I think secondly, which is mentioned by various people in the film, we can fall into traps of instrumental approaches. The idea is that women tend to be more altruistic, women deal more often with unpaid communal activities in the urban setting in the way that the work of Caroline Moser was highlighting a long time ago. So actually, climate change solutions can buy into that and be exploitative of gender relations in the urban setting. And I think thirdly, if you look at a lot of the way that climate change talks about gender, I'm not talking particularly in urban settings here, there's this casting women as vulnerable groups, which has symbolic importance in terms of how we negotiate for why dealing with climate change is important, but it has also a very problematic impact on women or urban poor women as active agents of change, if they're just seen as vulnerable groups. On the other hand, what I think, while responses to climate change can collude with these urban and gender inequalities, they also have the potential to disrupt those gender inequalities and those urban inequalities. And I think particularly getting back to the idea of market solutions, I think if we see market solutions as one of the underpinning problems that's causing climate change, but also one of the underpinning problems that's causing urban inequality and reinforcing and enabling gender inequality, then if we revisit governance options for how we deal with these things beyond the market and begin to revisit a stronger role for the state and non-market actors, that could be one way of beginning to address all these three things at the same time, so we see a sort of shared entry point. So I think if we accept those arguments that I think the film was making, then what that means is to understand how those things play out and how what the appropriate solutions would be. That means it's critical that the voices of men, women, but urban women and men specifically, come through in the debates about how we're shaping this. And this is something that has been quite well charted, and we talked about in the film, as an area that's problematic. So I work with, I'm on the board of the Women's Environment and Development Organisation, and they've looked very extensively at women's representation on the UNFCCC process. And actually, if you look at their data, it is problematic. Actually, across all the different panels, women have been consistently around 33%, which is better than most parliaments. But if you look at the spatial distribution of that regionally, in some contexts it's high, but in a lot of areas, and particularly the areas where we have the sort of biggest urban inequality and crises, it's very low for women, and in a lot of the panels there are no women at all. So we're seeing problems of representation there. And I think that will be a critical area to work, but I think maybe another question is, it's not just about having women represented on those panels or urban actors. The question is which women and which urban actors, and are we hearing the voices, getting back to what Virginia was talking about, of specifically the urban women and men living, for example, in informal settlements who are facing the crisis of climate change in cities and who are also being expected to sort of pick up the pieces in unpaid voluntary labour. So I think for me, when I do next see my friend who wanted a drink tonight, that's what I'll tell him.
I'm interested in a bit more about the practical action project, but I didn't get the complete project, so maybe you can.
The project is being funded by CDKN, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. You can find more information on cdkn.org. And it's being implemented by Practical Action and IDS in collaboration with ODI. And the three research questions that underpins the project are, we wanted to find the evidence for the relevance of using a gender approach when promoting climate-compatible development. Because often, especially in my work, I discuss with climate scientists and I tell them that I work on gender equality, and obviously they say, well, what's the point? Why are you doing this? What are the linkages? And often they say, do you have any facts that prove that gender matters when you work on climate? Which is extremely disturbing because we shouldn't have to justify why gender equality matters. It's a question of human rights. But sometimes it does help to have some kind of scientific evidence to prove, see, women are impacting in this way, men are also impacting this way, and then both gender groups have solutions to offer. So the first question was really to prove that a gender approach helps perhaps promoting better climate compatible development outcomes. The second research question was, to what extent does a gender sensitive approach help achieving better empowerment outcomes? This is much more tricky to address. And the third question was, what are the factors, like economic, social, political, or geographical, what are the factors that enable better climate compatible development approach that use a gender lens, if it makes sense? So these are our three research questions, and we focused on 3 different case studies, as I said, in Peru, Kenya, and India, where we selected projects that were having an urban angle as well as a climate angle. In Kenya, it focuses more on water access. In India, it focuses more on urban resilience. And we wanted to look at the impact of the project as well as the way the project was being designed and implemented. So it's both 2 levels. And so in each of the case study, we had like local teams of researchers, and we are currently compiling the analysis together. We hopefully will have the final reports by February 2016. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yes.
Maybe I missed this, but you were talking about the following the next COP21 and it's going to take place in Paris, and there might be more space for it. And then the Lima COP, and I managed to get into 2 or 3 kind of spaces. One was erected by the European Union, and the other one was by the CDKN. And in both spaces, a woman, she raises their hand and they say, what about the gender issue? And it felt to me like these 2 people were kind of seen as, like, I don't know, earlier Greenpeace activists, like they come into the conference and trying to raise their voice and like, who let these people in? Something like that was the feeling in the room. So that struck me. And I was wondering how this presence, or what are these spaces in this next COP21 going to materialize? What is it? What is in the figure that happened?
Well, I think at the moment, some of my colleagues are following how we're going to be doing things during the Paris Convention, but a bit closer than I am. But I regularly get very confused messages from people, what is exactly going to happen. Around gender, what we've been doing now is a bit of a guerrilla warfare, I feel. There's a lot of hiding behind the bush. There's a lot of, trying to find the right... It's, really, trying to find space. It's really kind of getting through, the little door and just trying to make it a little bit bigger. And because it's all a bit market-oriented, there's also a big issue around financing, because you have to pay for every square meter where you're going to be displaying your stuff. So you're a civil society organization, you pay, you work with voluntary people and no funds, you pay, and you're EDF, GDF, or a big energy company, you pay. So, it's like the same rule applies to everybody, which of course, feels a little bit unfair when you're not the big energy company. So that's one thing. Another thing that we are seeing is, exactly because of what Virginie was saying just now, it's like we need facts. So like everybody's running around frantically, saying we need to prove that this is not just, pure feminism that wants to, disturb, the scientific talks. So there's a lot of running around, but again, it all seems to me that it's happening in a very rushed manner, and I'm not too sure to what extent what we are producing now is not in the end going to be a little counterproductive, because I don't think there's proper time and proper thinking involved in what kind of research should be happening, and particularly how to link it to policy. So I think the subject is up on the table. I think it's up for grab, but I'm I think we're going to need to work a lot to really make it stay and make it happen and make it expand. Like Julian was saying, there is an issue about what women are around the table, and there are groups that have been working consistently, bringing the gender issues up on board. Now, how the connection is then being made to more local groups that are really struggling to get, really get information, but also to pass their information, up. It's not just about going to the bottom to get the information, but also, getting this kind of bottom-up movement. I think this is still not articulated properly. And then there is the articulation that needs to be made between, Asian, Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, and because things do work in slightly different ways. So there are many, many challenges in articulating this. We've had a few things in Paris recently with, some of the, the minister coming to talk about the issue, but we managed to get them for rather short periods of time, and it still feels like it's not quite a very thorough and a very profound commitment, and we're gonna have to really work on that on the issue of accountability. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on accountability, a lot. And we can't do it without finances, we can't do it without support, we can't do it without means. You can't expect civil society that is not being supported properly to do that job for nothing. It just doesn't work.
Many of the concrete linkages between gender urbanization and climate change so far seem to have focused on the social division of labor in the developing world. I was just curious how you see these linkages manifesting in the lives of women in cities of the developing world.
I mean, I think there are continuities that they play out in different ways, but I think a lot of, certainly what I'm looking at, is if you look at the gender division of labour, there's often the assumption that women are predominantly going to be responsible for unpaid care work. And I think if you look at urbanisation and some of the ways of trying to particularly cost basic resources which are going to be associated with climate change, that's always going to have a very uncomfortable interaction with access to unpaid care work for the basic sort of reproduction society, which is gendered. How it plays out sort of in the global north, it's not something that I work on particularly, but I imagine it would be similar. I can't give you concrete examples, sorry, but I think there are continuities in the sort of overarching gender division of labour, the salience of unpaid care work being gendered, and I think a lot of sort of cost cutting or management exercises to monetize or cost environmental ills is going to have gendered impacts through that. So.
Yeah, I can, again, as Julian, I don't really work in the developed world context, but I came across a fascinating movie on, I think it's the Swedish agency of, I can't remember, I'm sorry, but it was on the website of the European Institute for Gender Equality. And they did a study specifically on the impact of climate change and gender in Europe. And one of their examples was that with the prediction of climate change, more extreme weather events will create more snowfall in Northern Europe. And that had a gender impact because in one of the cities in Sweden, women were found to be the primary users of the public walkways or the curb. But at the moment in winter, they found that the municipal service didn't really clear the pathways, and therefore there were more accidents with women falling on the snow because they are the one using the street to go to the school or drop the children, because also women use more public transport or walk more than men in Europe. That's been proven. So at first it felt a bit like anecdotal, but at the same time they had like real convincing evidence and facts. So I really encourage you to look at that.
Well, similar examples around the issue of transport, and it's obviously something we're going to have to think about more, because unlike the MDGs that were just targeting the developing world, SDGs are for everybody. So I think there are lots of issues that so far we've only been looking at in the South as if, that's where it happens. And particularly around gender, this is where women are more vulnerable, as if, the gender inequalities were not so, they are different, but it obviously doesn't mean that they are none in the North. And this whole issue of transport, I think, is also coming up interestingly in a lot of northern countries, because as there is an encouragement to reduce the use of private transport, which is found in many countries to be, there are more cars owned by men than women. But as we encourage, everybody to go more to go more on public transport, it also means that public transport has to think much more about, what are the roads and what are the routes that women and men are using in their daily life, and also having to think about the connection between transport, being in public spaces, and issues of violence. Again, we know in countries there are some very interesting experiments just to try and reduce the level of violence that is happening in public space, because transport drops you so far away from where you actually live, and you have to walk through areas that are not protected, that are not well lit, that all these issues. So of course, if public transport becomes a bigger issue, we need to think about it in very much with gender lens. Yes.
And you mentioned that in Beijing there was more radical. And can you mention what ways? Why do you think this happened? And if Beijing happens to pick up neoliberal consensus as well? Right now it's supposedly opposed neoliberal, which never really happened. But why do you think this is taking place?
Well, that's a big one. Obviously, the timing is different. 1995, gender mainstreaming had not happened yet, and Beijing was about making it happen. Now, 20 years down the line, gender mainstreaming has started to happen. It's not fully yet there. But along the line, the fact that gender has become, more part of the mainstream discourse, in many ways going into institutions and organizations, the political edge of what gender mainstreaming was about primarily has kind of disappeared. And you do find now a lot of organizations that do gender, but they don't do political gender. They do practical gender. They do tick the box gender. Definitely mainstreaming has got a lot of advantages in the sense that it has taken gender out of a confined space. But by this happening, gender has also lost, in many contexts, a lot of its political edge. And one thing, for instance, that has really clearly disappeared from the SDG is all the talks on, human rights and sexual rights, reproductive sexual rights of women. It's something that is hardly there at all in the SDGs, and it was very, very strong in Beijing. And if you go back to the 12 areas of the platform, of the Beijing platform of action, you would actually find more, more things to get your teeth into, including to talk about urban and climate change, than you would, I think, in a lot of the SDG now. So I think we need to, just because it's 20 years old doesn't mean that it's less progressive than what we've got now. It's actually, I think, more progressive than what we've got now. And I think that's talking about, concrete examples. Definitely one thing that we see as well coming up is that the discussion on climate change is also bringing up the whole issue, for instance, on population control. And that has direct impact on sexual rights. How do you talk about, issues of climate change, and they are linked to population? How do you bring up this issue, not being able to discuss at the highest level, like at the Convention on the Rights of Women in New York? You just cannot discuss sexual rights anymore because you've got a number of countries that do not want to hear a thing about it. And yet, it's on the heart of the debate.
Yes.
Yeah, and I wonder whether the panel thought that these problems apply very severely to climate change policy, or a more kind of common issue across all areas of development policy.
Often I try to use climate change or disaster risk reduction as an entry point because that's what I work for, but as an entry point to re-emphasize that gender inequalities are pervasive everywhere and at every level of decision-making processes. One thing that struck me, and to echo what Claudie was saying, is as soon as we talk about political participation, when we are focusing on environmental issues and scientific facts, etc., we access a domain that is mostly discussed by activists. And so when you work on the research, it's something that is not very well received often. But the problem is when you also work with NGOs, there is this assumption that NGOs are neutral because they don't want to challenge the local practices. They want to respect people they interact with. They don't want to modify the culture. But at the same time, if there is a project, then definitely it's not neutral because NGOs are bringing their own values and their missions and their objectives from their own country or funding agencies. And so, to me, if we take a starting point saying there's nothing neutral, then we are touching this question of human rights and the lack of political participation of half of the population, which are women. And I think unless and until NGOs are not ready to be clearer on their political stance, then we are not going to be able to make more progress on gender equality, at least at the level of decision-making processes, because we're going to stay on superficial issues. We're going to address their practical needs as opposed to address their strategic interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree. I think that those issues of sort of representation and exclusion of different voices from policy making cuts across the board. But I think in terms of climate change, it's a particularly tricky issue because of the sort of technical, rational language it's couched in. I think it's always clear that there are some areas of policy making which tend to have more entry points for gender discussions, because they're related to the social spheres of life, which are seen as sort of genital health, education. I think there are far more openings for discussions, although some other aspects like population or sexual rights have their own barriers. And I think an additional thing, just talking about how the sort of climate change negotiations have happened, it's not just the sort of scientific technical language, it's also because it's very much based around this convention-setting UN approach. I was talking to a colleague, and Guido had asked, was I going to COP in Paris, and I wasn't sure, and I didn't think so. But I was speaking to a colleague who'd been, and she went, "Oh, don't bother going, it's a complete waste of time, unless you have a very specific sort of word that you want in a paragraph." So it's a very sort of legal insider process, and that creates big barriers for very much the activist voices of women and men, particularly in urban poor communities. There are, again, there's the gender climate change. So there are these big alliances. That's sort of, I think it's 180 different civil society groups who are working on this. But I think working very much from the outside of what feels like quite a closed, legalistic agenda setting environment.
Yeah, I just wanted to share the example of a small project that we are involved in at the moment in Ivory Coast. There are going to be elections. The presidential elections are happening now at the end of this month in Ivory Coast, and they are the first elections since the big conflict that happened in between 2005 and 2008. So it's quite a critical moment. And we're working with a group of organizations, women's organizations. We have this project called the Network of Observatories on Gender Inequality, and they're part of this project. And so the project that is happening at the moment, it's not really a project, it's more of a movement, more of an activity. The title of it is Si vous voulez nos voix, entendez les nôtres. So if you want us to vote for you, you have to hear what we're saying. It's just play on word on the voice, which is the same in French for voice and votes. And as we were discussing that, what kind of campaign they wanted to, because they are SMSing candidates, and they are calling upon they go to their offices and they ask to talk to them, and they create all sorts of meetings in the marketplace with local women, etc. And at some point the question was raised as to, are you going to include any kind of revendication around the issue of climate change? And they went like, gosh, like what? And then they started talking, what does climate change look like when you're a woman and you've got unequal gender relations? What does it look like? How do you describe it? And so they had to go into all the various issues that they wanted to bring on board. Like they had lots of issues around health, access to health. And they say like, okay, what does climate change does to health? And it's quite obvious in particularly the coastal cities. I mean, they've never noticed such an increase of malaria, for instance. I mean, some vector-borne diseases that had nearly not disappeared, but that were kind of under control, that are no more under control. And issues of education. What does climate change look like in terms of, your right to education? Well, it's when the floods are everywhere and you can't access school anymore. It's when an economic crisis, when there's, I think the poster of the event, I don't know if you saw it as you came in, but it's just the flooded marketplace. And, how do you carry on working, particularly in the informal sector, when you can't even go across the road and your customers can't even reach you, and because the floods are just recurring and they last longer and they are deeper and deeper each time. So they had to actually, nearly like draw kind of a map of what does climate change look like and how does it cut across health and education and, access to all sorts of activities. And I think that's a job that we need to do. It's like, what does it look like? Because it's one of those words that we need to unpack. I mean, at the moment, it's a bit of a Yeti word. It's like, I don't really know what it looks like.
We have time for one more, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Beatrice Gudala, I'm also from the Development Institute, different in that region. It was very interesting presentations and movie, very thought-provoking. I was wondering whether you have views on the question of whether the current debate around the refugee crisis and migration could offer a window of opportunity, an entry point to raise these questions around climate change, urbanisation and gender. Because clearly, it's not going to be only refugees. There's a question of people moving out of rural areas because their livelihoods have been affected by climate change, or because to cope with increased flooding and health issues and so on, moving probably into cities, into urban areas, because this is where the economic opportunities are, putting pressure on already strained system delivery service system deliveries. So this is a question that the international community, NGOs, governments, donors will have to start thinking. Do you think this is an entry point for the issues that we've been debating today? And more generally, do you see other entry points? Where would you go and what would you say to make the points that you've been making today? Easy question for you.
Yeah, migration is definitely an entry point. But I see migration as both a great adaptive capacity as well as an unsustainable coping strategy. And I've just started to really think about it, and I'm going to try to put a proposal to answer that question later. But I think we need to find out more if migration is truly capacities that work well for men and women. And at the moment, I think it really depends on the context. It really depends whether migrants are household, like all families moving together, or if it's just the men migrating to find more jobs and sending remittances, or if it's the women who are, especially in the context of East Africa, women going to the cities to work as domestic labor, and then also being more at risk of huge problem of sexual violence. So I think this question of migration needs to be really unpacked, and the buzz around migration at the moment could really help focus more light on this topic. For other entry points, I have to think about it more.
I mean, I think it's a big question. It is something actually a colleague at the Development Planning Unit, Cassidy Johnson's been. She organised a sort of collective work that a lot of people in the department contributed to. That was funded by DFID, which was looking at the urban dimensions of humanitarian crisis. So I think there's a lot of continuities there, particularly as increasingly humanitarian crises in cities are going to come from climate change events, as we've seen already. And I think some of the points they were making there is often the responses to those kind of humanitarian crises in cities, which may come from climate change, will tend to collude, as I was sort of trying to say before, will tend to collude with existing inequalities and exacerbate them. So I think for me, one of the first things is to actually understand when we're dealing with those sort of crises and migration in the urban setting, do we deal with them in a way which exacerbates those inequalities and sometimes makes use of them or not? And I think I couldn't give you particular examples now, but I think it's an area that needs to be explicitly thought about and discussed, and it's a sort of, I think it's an interesting research agenda.
I mean, given the current debate on migration and the threat that it represents to Europe and all of that, my fear would be that we actually forget that most migration, most climatic related migration actually happens within regions. They do happen, it's people moving from rural areas into cities, or maybe from one country to the next country, and not so much, unlike what some politicians want us to believe, moving up north to Europe. My fear would be that the future work on the link between migration and climate change, first, that it would forget gender, that's one thing. And then that it would actually focus on dealing with climate change back into rural areas so that people don't leave, rather than working also in urban settings where people have already moved. The level of political thinking at the moment on migration, I don't think is very conducive to actions that are really place the emphasis where the needs really are. I mean, the needs of the people are, but more in terms of the perceived needs of controlling migration rather than helping people to deal with migration. So that would be my fear, and that gender in the process would be totally displaced.
One more question. I saw a hand up at the back. Yes, I'm afraid we have to.
I was just wondering if you know of anybody, like you've talked a lot about how the impact of gender inequalities due to the impact of climate change and the solutions in mitigations and this kind of thing. But I don't know if you know anybody talking about the impact in gendered inequalities but before that, I mean, in the moment of actually implementing a reduction of emissions, like changing the electrical systems or whatever, like how does that affect the gendered inequalities?
A lot of the cooking is done with coal, and the women do the cooking. So in N'Djamena, the commission decided that there should be drastic reduction of the emission of smokes from coal, and that people should stop using coal. So then what do you do? What do you do? So if you do not look at who is using the coal and it's not because you're going to have to stop using coal that you have to stop cooking. So then you have to continue cooking. So you've got to use other stuff to cook. And so, your life is just miserable because there's no alternative. I think the big issue is, it's all very well to plan all sorts of strategies for, to reduce, climate change. But then what are what alternatives are being proposed? and how much women are involved in proposing alternatives? I think that's my main concern. But there are plenty examples, plenty. They just need to be compiled, and they need to start forming a real corpus of evidence that we can work on.
Yes. On that last point about how people are going to get by in terms of their energy needs in African countries, and how that impacts indeed the lives of everyone, women and men and children, just wanted to highlight the fact that through USL's Grand Challenges programme and its relationship with the French Embassy through its Science and Technology Department, we're running a series of events with the global title Towards Decarbonising Economies. And yesterday evening we had the first event in the series, the nexus between global energy and global climate. And then the second event will indeed focus on the impact of deliberations at the COP21 meeting in Paris in December on global south countries, and what we need to know in terms of how poorer countries are going to achieve their development goals without burning vast amounts of carbon. The extent to which they can perhaps leapfrog some of the dirty industrialization stages of older countries in order to achieve prosperity and well-being for their peoples. And so we have the prospect of, I think, a very interesting second event in March, involving people from the Energy Institute and from UCL's Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy Department, along with colleagues from France, from IDRI and CIRED, who I think are going to be very enthusiastic contributors. So this event today has given me plenty of stimulation and impetus to ensure that the gender dimension is well represented in that event in March.
I hope that you'll take some of the issues that we talked about tonight back into your various contexts where you are, classrooms or more activist arenas, and continue the conversation. We are going to make the film available on our website, and as I said, it's likely that it might change just a little bit as we refine things, so you're welcome to access it and use it in whatever way you need to, both for research or for teaching or for advocacy in the next 6 months or so. So thank you so much all for coming. It's been really a very stimulating evening, and thank you for your patience and attention. Thank you to my colleagues.